You think you know history? You think those marble statues and Hollywood epics tell the real story of Rome? But what if I told you that everything you've been taught about the greatest empire in human history has been carefully sanitized, deliberately obscured, and systematically buried for nearly 2,000 years? My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I've discovered after 15 years of research in archives that most scholars never see, in private collections that powerful families would rather keep hidden, and in archaeological sites where certain findings never make it into official reports. 3 months ago, I was like you. I believed the textbook version of Roman history. I thought the emperors were just ambitious politicians with a taste for spectacle and conquest. I was wrong, dead wrong, and once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand why certain people have worked so hard to keep these truths buried beneath 2 millennia of carefully constructed lies. It started with a single document, a fragment of papyrus that should never have survived the burning of Alexandria. A piece of writing that changes everything we thought we knew about the true nature of Roman power. Last winter, I received a call from a contact in Vienna. He'd heard about my work on ancient mystery religions and wanted to show me something that had been sitting in a private vault since 1945. Something the Nazis had been very interested in, something they'd stolen from a monastery in Greece before retreating from the advancing Allied forces. The document was written in a mixture of Latin and Greek, on papyrus that carbon dating would later confirm was from the 1st century. But what made my hands shake as I read it wasn't its age, it was the name at the bottom, a signature I recognized from countless imperial decrees, a name that appears on monuments across 3 continents. The author was someone history tells us was one of Rome's greatest leaders. What he described in that document should have been impossible, according to everything we know about Roman religion, about Roman culture, about Roman values. But there it was, in his own words, describing rituals that would make the most hardened investigator sick to their stomach. Practices that explained so much about how Rome truly maintained its power. You see, we've been told that Roman leaders were pragmatic, that their religion was mostly ceremonial, that their brutality was simply the way of the ancient world. But this document revealed something else entirely. It revealed that the most powerful men in Rome were following a system of beliefs that went far beyond mere political ambition. They were participating in something that connected them to forces that rational minds prefer not to acknowledge. The first emperor to practice what that document described ruled for over 40 years. History remembers him as a great builder, a patron of the arts, a man who brought peace to the empire. But according to his own words, his success came from something much darker. From ceremonies conducted in hidden chambers beneath the Palatine Hill. From rituals that required specific sacrifices at specific times. From practices that bound him to entities that promised power in exchange for loyalty. I know how this sounds. I know you're thinking this is the ravings of a madman, or the fabrication of a forger. But hear me out. Because what I found next changed everything I thought I knew about cause and effect, about coincidence and conspiracy, about the line between the rational and the impossible. After translating that first document, I started looking for patterns. If this emperor had truly been involved in these practices, there would be evidence. Subtle evidence that historians had missed because they weren't looking for it. Evidence hidden in plain sight across the archaeological record. And by God, I found it. The first thing I noticed was the timing. Every major military victory, every successful conquest, every period of prosperity during his reign coincided with specific dates. Dates that corresponded to an ancient calendar system that predated Rome itself. A calendar based on celestial alignments that most modern scholars dismiss as primitive superstition. But these weren't random coincidences. The pattern was too precise, too consistent. It was as if this emperor had access to some kind of intelligence that allowed him to time his actions with supernatural precision. As if he knew exactly when to strike, when to negotiate, when to consolidate power. The second thing I discovered was the architecture. Hidden within the design of his greatest buildings were symbols that had nothing to do with traditional Roman religion. Symbols that appeared in occult texts from across the ancient world. Symbols that were carved into the foundation stones where no one would ever see them unless they knew what to look for. These weren't decorative elements, they were functional. They were part of a system that had been designed to channel and focus energy in ways that would have been completely foreign to ordinary Roman citizens. Ways that would have been familiar to practitioners of the oldest mystery traditions. But the third discovery was what convinced me that this went far beyond one emperor's personal eccentricities. I found evidence that this system had been passed down through generations of Roman leaders, that it had become the secret foundation of imperial power itself. Every emperor who ruled for more than a decade showed the same patterns, the same timing of major events, the same hidden symbols in their monuments, the same connection to forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of political power. The emperors who ignored these practices, who tried to rule through conventional means alone, invariably faced disaster. Civil wars, plagues, famines, military defeats. It was as if the empire itself was bound to these dark practices. As if Rome's very survival depended on maintaining agreements that had been made centuries before. This is where the story gets truly disturbing. Because I realized that I wasn't just looking at historical curiosity. I was looking at a system of power that had never really ended. A system that had simply evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression. The last emperor to practice these rituals ruled in the 5th century. According to official history, he was weak, ineffective, and presided over the collapse of the Western Empire. But according to the documents I found, he made a conscious choice. He chose to end the ancient agreements rather than continue practices that he had come to see as abominations. His decision to break the cycle came at a terrible cost. Within a generation, Rome fell to barbarian invasions. The greatest empire in human history crumbled not because of military weakness or economic collapse, but because its leaders had severed their connection to the source of their power. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. The Eastern Empire, which would later become known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years of prosperity, of military success, of cultural achievement, and according to the documents I've found, they never broke the ancient agreements. They simply became more careful about hiding them. The practices that began in pagan Rome were absorbed into Christian Rome. The rituals were adapted, the symbols were reinterpreted, but the essential system remained intact. The emperors who ruled from Constantinople weren't just Christian monarchs. They were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of the city on the Seven Hills. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, something interesting happened. The last emperor's personal effects were scattered across Europe. His private library ended up in the hands of powerful families who had been allies of the Byzantine court. Families who understood the true nature of the documents they had inherited. These families didn't just preserve the ancient knowledge, they used it. They adapted it to new circumstances, new forms of government, new ways of exercising power. The rituals that had once been performed in marble temples beneath the Palatine Hill were now conducted in private chapels in Venice, in hidden chambers in Vienna, in manor houses across the English countryside. The age of exploration wasn't driven by mere curiosity or commercial ambition. The most successful explorers, the ones who survived impossible odds and established lasting empires, were connected to families who possessed this ancient knowledge. Families who knew when to sail, where to establish colonies, how to maintain control over vast territories using methods that went far beyond superior weaponry or organizational skills. The colonial empires that dominated the world for centuries weren't built on technological advantage alone. They were built on the same foundation that had once made Rome invincible. The same understanding of forces that operate outside the normal boundaries of cause and effect. The same willingness to make agreements that rational minds would reject as impossible. This is why certain historical patterns keep repeating, why empires rise and fall according to cycles that seem to have their own logic, why some leaders achieve the impossible while others fail despite having every advantage. It's not luck, it's not genius, it's knowledge. Ancient knowledge that has been passed down through generations of people who understand that power has sources that textbooks never mention. I've spent the last 3 months verifying every detail I could. I've traveled to archives in 7 countries. I've interviewed descendants of families whose names appear in documents spanning 15 centuries. I've examined artifacts that museums don't display, that private collectors keep in climate-controlled vaults, that some people would kill to possess. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. The system that gave Rome its power never died. It just became more sophisticated, more hidden, more carefully guarded. The people who control it today are the inheritors of a tradition that has shaped human history for over 2,000 years. They don't call themselves Romans, they don't wear purple togas or build amphitheaters. But they follow the same principles, perform the same rituals, maintain the same agreements with forces that most people prefer to believe don't exist. The financial systems that control global commerce, the political networks that determine who rises to power, the media empires that shape public opinion. They're all connected to families who trace their authority back to these ancient practices. Families who know that real power doesn't come from votes or market forces or military might, it comes from understanding how to work with energies that operate according to laws that science hasn't discovered yet. This is why certain dates keep appearing in major historical events. Why certain symbols appear in the architecture of power centers around the world. Why certain bloodlines keep producing leaders who achieve the impossible. It's not coincidence, it's system. The same system that once made Rome the master of the known world. I know this sounds like the ravings of a conspiracy theorist. I know you're thinking about secret societies and shadowy cabals and all the usual cliches. But I'm not talking about people in robes meeting in basement chambers. I'm talking about something much more sophisticated, much more embedded in the normal operations of power. The people who possess this knowledge don't need to meet in secret locations. They look like everyone else, they talk like everyone else, but they understand things that everyone else doesn't. They understand that reality has layers. That influence operates through channels that rational analysis can't detect. That certain actions at certain times in certain places can produce effects that seem to violate everything we think we know about cause and effect. This is why some corporate mergers succeed beyond all reasonable expectations while others fail despite perfect planning. Why some political campaigns overcome impossible odds while others collapse despite having every advantage. Why some military operations achieve miraculous victories while others fail catastrophically despite superior resources. The people who make these decisions aren't just relying on market research and polling data and intelligence reports. They're using knowledge that goes back to the foundations of Roman power. And the prices are always paid. That's the part that makes this so disturbing. The ancient agreements that gave Rome its power didn't come free. They required specific forms of payment. Forms of payment that modern inheritors of this knowledge have found ways to provide without attracting attention. The famines that occur with suspicious regularity in certain parts of the world. The conflicts that erupt with precise timing in strategically important regions. The disasters that strike with almost supernatural accuracy at moments when they serve the interests of people who are never directly connected to them. These aren't random events. They're part of a system, part of a payment schedule that has been maintained for centuries. This is why humanitarian aid never seems to address the root causes of suffering. Why peace negotiations always seem to fall apart at crucial moments. Why the most obvious solutions to global problems are never implemented despite having overwhelming popular support. The problems aren't bugs in the system, they're features. They're part of the payment structure that keeps the ancient agreements in force. The leaders who benefit from this system aren't necessarily evil in any conventional sense. They're just people who have inherited knowledge that allows them to work with forces that operate according to their own logic. Forces that provide power in exchange for specific forms of tribute. Forces that have been shaping human history since long before Rome existed. Rome didn't create this system. Rome just perfected it. The emperors who ruled from the Seven Hills weren't the first to discover how to work with these forces. They were just the first to systematize the knowledge, to create institutions that could preserve and transmit it across generations. The mystery schools of Egypt, the temple complexes of Mesopotamia, the sacred sites of the Celtic Druids, they were all part of the same tradition. All working with the same forces according to the same basic principles. Rome's genius was to militarize this knowledge, to turn spiritual practices into instruments of imperial power. And that's what makes the current situation so dangerous. The people who control this knowledge today have resources that the Roman emperors could never have imagined. They have technologies that can influence millions of people simultaneously. They have financial instruments that can move wealth across continents in seconds. They have weapons that can reshape the physical environment of entire regions. But they're still operating according to the same ancient principles. They're still maintaining the same agreements with forces that demand the same forms of payment. They're just doing it on a scale that makes the Roman Empire look like a small-town political machine. The signs are everywhere if you know how to look for them. The timing of major events follows patterns that go back thousands of years. The symbols that appear in corporate logos and government seals and architectural designs all trace back to the same ancient sources. The bloodlines that produce generation after generation of leaders all connect to families who have preserved this knowledge across centuries. But here's what really terrifies me. I think they're preparing for something that will make the rise and fall of Rome look like a minor historical footnote. The patterns I've been tracking over the last 3 months are accelerating. The timing of events is becoming more precise. The symbols are becoming more obvious. It's as if they're no longer concerned about hiding what they're doing. This could mean one of two things. Either they're so confident in their power that they no longer fear exposure, or they're approaching some kind of culmination that will make secrecy irrelevant. Either way, it suggests that we're living through a period of transition. A period when the hidden history of the world is about to become visible in ways that will change everything we think we know about power, about reality, about the forces that shape human destiny. The question is, what we're going to do about it. Because now that you know what I know, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to believing that history is just a series of random events, shaped by human ambition and technological progress. You can't pretend that the patterns I've shown you are just coincidences. You have a choice to make. You can dismiss this as the fantasies of a delusional researcher who has spent too much time in dusty archives. You can convince yourself that the evidence I've presented is just the product of an overactive imagination looking for patterns that don't really exist. Or you can start looking for the truth yourself. You can start noticing the dates, the symbols, the bloodlines, the patterns that surround every major event in human history. You can start asking questions about why certain things happen when they happen, about who benefits from disasters that seem to serve no rational purpose, about the real sources of power in a world that claims to be rational and democratic. But I warn you, once you start seeing the connections, you won't be able to stop. Once you understand how the system really works, you'll see its influence everywhere. And you'll realize that almost everything you've been taught about history, about politics, about the nature of power itself, has been carefully designed to keep you from seeing the truth that goes back to the 7 hills of Rome, the truth that explains why some people rise to power while others fall, the truth that reveals the real price of empire and the forces that still collect payment in the shadows of our modern world. The Romans were right about one thing: all roads do lead to Rome. They just never told you that Rome never really fell, it just learned to hide better.